Good evening and thanks for joining us. The top stories today. George Floyd's brother testifies to Congress on a police reform bill. He's calling for unity and positive changes in law enforcement. The Federal Reserve said today that it will keep the near-zero interest rate unchanged to support U.S. economic recovery, but it also predicts it will be a long road back from the pandemic. 5 states are tallying up primary election votes after people took to the polls yesterday. Some results are in, but others are facing delays. Lawmakers in New York respond to the nationwide protests calling for a change in policing practices. Yesterday, they passed a bill that would make police discipline records public. And internal documents reveal a secret police agency in China might still be operating, but just under a new name. That's after it supposedly dissolved 2 years ago. Today, George Floyd's brother testified before Congress. Lawmakers went over a police reform bill that would make significant changes to law enforcement. NTD's Miguel Moreno has more on the hearing.
The brother of George Floyd testified to Congress Wednesday on a police reform bill.
People of all backgrounds, genders, and races have come together to demand change. Honor them, honor George, and make the necessary changes that make law enforcement the solution and not the problem.
For one, the Justice and Policing Act proposed by House Democrats would amend the qualified immunity statute. The reform would disqualify state and local officers from the immunity if they say they acted in good faith or believed that their conduct was legal at the time of doing it. If passed, the bill would also push police departments to ban the use of chokeholds, ban no-knock warrants in drug cases, and more. Several other speakers sympathized with Floyd, called for greater accountability for officers, and defended the police force.
If we are going to talk about better policing, we also need to talk about the root causes behind the need for those calls for service. Some think defunding the police is the answer. History has shown that underfunding the police can have disastrous consequences and hurt those most in need of our services.
Reform may also be coming from the White House. The press secretary says President Trump has been listening to protesters and working quietly on proposals.
The president has spent the last 10 days quietly and diligently working on proposals to address the issues that the protesters have raised across the country, legitimate issues. And that body of work, I'm told, is reaching its final edits, and we hope to produce it for you in the coming days.
She also called less immunity for officers a non-starter, quoting Attorney General William Barr, who said that would result in officers pulling back. Miguel Moreno, NTD News.
Also today, the White House press secretary gave the president's response to the recent talk of renaming military bases.
These monumental and very powerful bases have become part of a great American heritage and a history of winning, victory, and freedom. The United States of America trained and deployed our heroes here and won 2 world wars. Therefore, my administration will not even consider the renaming of these magnificent and fabled military installations.
Calls for the bases to be renamed come amid more dialogue about race relations in America. The bases in question were named after Confederate military leaders. And the Treasury Secretary testified on the virus aid package known as CARES today. The $3 trillion package was introduced at the height of the pandemic to help struggling small businesses and individual Americans.
Members of the Senate Small Business Committee on Wednesday praised Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin and the government for saving millions of businesses during the CCP virus lockdowns. Chairman Marco Rubio called the Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP, an extraordinary success in a most uncertain economic situation. The PPP offered forgivable loans to small businesses to keep workers on payroll. It's credited with saving tens of millions of jobs. There was also controversy when large businesses received the loans when they shouldn't have. $12 billion of this was returned after public outcry. Mnuchin told the committee the economy is now well positioned for a strong reopening. A report last week shows around 90% of small businesses are at least partially reopened or planning to reopen soon.
We remain confident that the overall economy will continue to improve dramatically in the third and fourth quarters of this year.
Still, the Treasury Secretary feels another round of stimulus will be needed for the industries and small businesses that are still hurting. He called on both parties to work out the details. The new package may include another stimulus check for individual Americans. Getting people spending again will be critical for the country's recovery. Mnuchin also stressed the importance of getting Americans back to work as soon as possible.
The Federal Reserve, though, painted a grim picture for economic recovery today. It says the measures put in place to stop the virus spreading will have a lasting effect on the economy. To help, the Fed will keep interest rates near zero, and they'll likely stay there for another 2.5 years.
The Federal Reserve on Wednesday left interest rates unchanged at near zero to support the economy, and that rate is likely to last until 2022.
In March, we quickly lowered our policy interest rate to near zero, where we expect to keep it until we are confident that the economy has weathered recent events and is on track to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals.
In its first economic projection since the pandemic began, the central bank painted a grim picture of recovery, indicating the measures put in place to fight the crisis will echo through the economy for years and be difficult to quickly reverse. It expects the U.S. economy to shrink 6.5% this year and unemployment to be 9.3% at year's end. Going forward, the recovery is expected to begin in earnest in 2021, with growth forecast at 5% and 3.5% for 2022. The jobless rate is expected to go down to 6.5% in 2021 and 5.5% in 2022. That's still 2 percentage points higher than where it was at the end of last year. Hamrick says there's still a great amount of uncertainty. The projections should be seen as best guesses. The numbers will be updated quarterly down the road.
They're indicative of limited expectations for the economy for the foreseeable future.
In other news, the International Economic Organization, or OECD, forecast a similar scale of contraction for the global economy this year.
Now, on the economic front, the 6% decline in global GDP that we foresee in 2020 is larger by far than any we have projected in the 60 years since the OECD was created.
The organization projects the global economy will bounce back with 5.2% growth in 2021 on condition that the outbreak is kept under control.
And yesterday, 5 states took to the polls for their primaries, and the results are in. Mostly. Here's the roundup.
In what's on track to become the most expensive race in South Carolina history, Senator Lindsey Graham has defeated 3 little-known GOP challengers. All of his state's officials have endorsed him, plus President Trump and Vice President Mike Pence. His victory on Tuesday comes as the last marker ahead of a general election face-off with Democrat Jamie Harrison. Meanwhile, in Georgia, the state's Democratic Senate primary is too early to call. Georgia election rules require candidates to win more than 50% of the vote to avoid a runoff. As of early Tuesday, with 93% reporting, John Ossoff has approximately 49% of the vote. He leads Teresa Tomlinson, who has roughly 15%, and Sarah Riggs Amico with about 13%. The winner will challenge Republican Senator David Perdue in November. That's after problems erupted at the polls when many of the Peach State's new voting machines broke down, causing long waiting lines. Turning to Nevada, hundreds of voters waited for hours at a mere 3 in-person polling places in the Las Vegas area, which were reduced amid virus concerns. Voting has continued into Wednesday, and state officials predict long delays in counting ballots. In North Dakota, results were promising for political newcomers David Ondal and David Nehring. They're taking on Republican House Appropriations Chairman Jeff Delzer. All 53 counties in the state opted for mail-in voting, with the results still pending. And despite the state's hottest day of the year, West Virginians took to the polls to decide presidential, gubernatorial, Senate, and House candidates in West Virginia's Democratic and Republican primaries. They were also deciding a majority of the 5-member state Supreme Court.
A grand jury has indicted one of the country's top chemists for making false statements. The Harvard professor allegedly lied about receiving money from the Chinese regime and about his involvement in China's Thousand Talents program.
On Tuesday, a federal grand jury indicted Harvard professor Charles Lieber for making false statements to federal authorities. Lieber is charged with lying about his involvement in China's Thousand Talents program. Lieber has denied the accusations. According to the Justice Department, the Chinese regime uses the program to lure foreign experts to bring their knowledge and experience to China and rewards them for stealing intellectual property. The court documents say Lieber specializes in research on nanoscience, and he has received over $15 million in grants from the National Institutes of Health and the Department of Defense. But to get those grants, one has to be open about any other sources of funding, conflicts of interest, and foreign collaboration. The charging documents allege that without Harvard's knowledge, Lieber became a strategic scientist at the Wuhan University of Technology in China in 2011. The court alleges Lieber entered into a contract with China's Thousand Talents program at least from 2012 to 2015. In the contract, the Chinese university allegedly paid Lieber $50,000 a month. It paid him $1.5 million to establish a research lab in Wuhan. In 2018 and 2019, the Harvard professor allegedly lied about his involvement in the program. The charge of making false statements carries a sentence of up to 5 years in prison, 3 years of supervised release, and a fine of $250,000. Lieber is set to be arraigned at a later date.
New York State lawmakers passed a bill yesterday that would make police officers' records available to the public. The lawmakers are responding to calls for more police accountability.
New York State lawmakers repealed a decades-old law Tuesday that kept law enforcement disciplinary records secret. One opponent of the bill is concerned about releasing unproven information.
By putting out unsubstantiated claims, we are essentially opening up those offices to public shaming just by the mere fact that someone put in a complaint.
Eliminating the law known as Section 50A would make complaints and disciplinary records public for the first time in decades. Governor Andrew Cuomo said he will sign it. The repeal came as protesters call for the reform of policing practices in the wake of the death of George Floyd. One supporter says it's not enough. People aren't protesting for watered-down legislation.
I applaud the sponsor of this piece of legislation for being consistent with it over 5 years. However, honesty compels me to say, big deal, you have to give up your background.
One opponent says they're reacting too fast. It's not the right way to fix the problem.
I don't think enough stakeholders have been involved in this to get this done right. We need to slow down, and if you want to fix this, this is not the way to do it.
Only Delaware has a similar law. The legislature passed other police accountability measures on Monday. More are expected.
And coming up, the U.S. Secretary of State released the 2019 report on international religious freedom today. Find out more about it after the break.
When you look at TV networks in America, a soundbite and fight-it-out culture prevails on news and commentary programs. As a Canadian, I'm fascinated with America, and I wanted to offer American thought leaders an opportunity to share their thoughts in a deep dive format where we can explore their ideas together. And so American Thought Leaders was born. The world's most brilliant thinkers believed that open discourse was the key to greatness. However, all around the world, we see that discourse is being stifled and political agendas have subverted media. The Epoch Times launched its Global Thought Leaders program to bring back this great tradition of free thought. As the host of American Thought Leaders, every week I interview some of the most intriguing minds on the most pressing issues of our time. Be sure to check out our new episodes every week.
A new report from the State Department today, this time about international religious freedom. It follows the President Trump's executive order last week to prioritize religious freedom in foreign aid packages.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo on Wednesday unveiling the Office of International Religious Freedom's latest report to Congress. Ambassador of the alliance said repression of faith is unfortunately still too common.
In many places of the world, individuals have become more familiar with religious oppression than religious freedom.
In the worst cases, people are persecuted for their faith and forced to abandon their beliefs or face government backlash.
China continues its decades-long war on faith.
The report reveals last year the Chinese Communist Party regime arrested and detained more than 6,000 people who practice Falun Gong, a meditation discipline that focuses on the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. The regime banned the practice in 1999 and continues even now to harass and detain Falun Gong practitioners and people of other faiths, even going so far as to label Falun Gong and a number of Christian groups evil cults.
The Chinese Communist Party is now ordering religious organizations to obey CCP leadership and infuse communist dogma into their teachings and practice of their faith. The mass detentions of Uyghurs in Xinjiang continues. So does the repression of Tibetans and Buddhists and Falun Gong and Christians.
There are reports that the regime forcibly harvests organs from these prisoners of conscience while they're detained. Another focus of Pompeo and his team is freeing 6 American oil executives who have been detained in Venezuela for 2.5 years without trial. As for the Western Hemisphere, Pompeo says the U.S. is working to end forced labor of over 10,000 Cuban healthcare workers, among other initiatives. Melina Weisskopf, NTD News.
It's been called the Gestapo of China. The 610 office is one of the Chinese regime's most notorious agencies. It's tasked with cracking down on dissidents and religious minorities. It was supposedly disbanded 2 years ago, but internal documents indicate its functions are still being actively carried out, only under a different name.
The Chinese regime established the 610 office on June 10, 1999, 21 years ago. A Chinese human rights lawyer has compared it to Hitler's Gestapo. Although it's little known outside China, it is extremely powerful. The Chinese regime set up this extra-legal organization in 1999 to persecute the spiritual practice Falun Gong. It later expanded to also targeting people who believed in other so-called unapproved spiritual practices, like house church Christians and Buddhists, as well as human rights lawyers. The 610 office operates at every level of Chinese society. It reported directly to the top Chinese Communist Party leader at the time, Jiang Zemin. On the surface, the CCP says this organization no longer exists. Current communist leader Xi Jinping gradually weakened and eventually disbanded the office through structural reforms after he took power in 2012. But an internal document recently obtained by NTD's sister media, the Epoch Times, presents a different reality. The 610 office may have just changed the name due to pressure from international human rights groups and may be operating under a different group called the Anti-Heretical Religion Guidance Branch. Beijing's Fangshan district issued a report from the agency in 2019. It shows the agency giving scores on how well 93 different Communist Party and government institutions are implementing the CCP's anti-religious policies, things like whether they successfully prevented religious gatherings, or if they have successfully transformed and educated religious believers to renounce their faith. The agencies being assessed range across all sectors of the government, from the powerful Political and Legal Affairs Commission, PLAC, to the Organization Department, which is in charge of assigning officials posts and promotions, to local police bureaus, local prosecutors' offices, and courts, among others. Some seem completely unrelated to religious affairs, like the local tax bureau, the meteorological administration, the earthquake administration, the Red Cross, and the urban greening bureau. The report shows none of these agencies escapes the scrutiny of the de facto 610 office. The Urban Greening Bureau, for example, was scored down for not having enough people taking a so-called anti-cult quiz. The quiz asks people what to do when they spot a religious gathering, and the right answer is to report it to the Chinese police. Another document from 2018 shows the agency is even involved in foreign affairs. At that time, the Fangshan District 610 office paid for Communist Party officials to visit Canada. They carried out a campaign against heretical religions in Montreal, Toronto, and Ottawa. The so-called overseas struggle activities in Canada focused on promoting hatred of Falun Gong. The Communist Agency held anti-cult symposiums and paid local Chinese language media to run propaganda against the practice. According to Minghui.org, a website that documents the CCP's persecution of Falun Gong, over 4,000 Falun Gong adherents in China have been killed due to the persecution.
And coming up, the UN says 40% of North Koreans don't have enough food. Although food shortages are common in North Korea, it's getting worse. Find out why after the break.
Hello there. Doesn't it feel like we're moving further away from the very values that our republic was built upon? And the media in our country have just been adding fuel to the flame, which is why you need to try The Epoch Times. It's pure, honest journalism that's restoring traditional values and reports the news with no spin, no hidden agendas, and no false narratives. So if you want to know the truth about the FISA abuse that took place during the 2016 election, or how socialist and communist ideologies have been infiltrating our society, or how the Chinese Communist Party's cover-up led to this global pandemic, and so much more, then you need to try The Epoch Times. And for a limited time, you can try the paper yourself for a full month for just $1, and we'll send you a very special gift. A 58-page magazine that investigates the truth behind the Chinese Communist Party's cover-up of the virus. So go to readepoch.com, try The Epoch Times, get your free gift, and stay truly informed.
According to the UN, a huge number of North Korea's population is in need of humanitarian aid. The country is currently experiencing a worsening of food shortages.
According to a UN human rights expert, North Korea is suffering widespread food shortages and malnutrition. While North Korea has a history of food shortages, the situation is even worse now, thanks to a nearly 5-month border closure with China and strict quarantine measures. According to the UN, medicine prices are skyrocketing, and some people have only corn to eat while others are starving. In the mid-90s, a famine killed around 3 million people in the isolated country. As of now, over 10 million people, almost 40% of the population, suffer from food insecurity and are in urgent need of food assistance. Due to the shortage of suitable agricultural land, North Korea always faces a challenge in growing enough staple food to feed its population. It's a crucial time for rice growers, who are currently moving young rice seedlings from the crowded beds where they were planted to the big fields. So far, farmers have seen less than ideal weather. And there are other problems to tackle at the moment. The UN urged North Korea to free prisoners during the pandemic because people in their prisons are dying as a result of contagious diseases, overcrowding, and hard work with the lack of food. The true state of the CCP virus situation in the country is uncertain, as North Korea refuses to report its case numbers to the WHO.
In the latest partnership between big tech and Wall Street, Amazon and Goldman Sachs are joining forces to offer small business loans. That and more in today's Business Briefs.
CNBC reports Amazon is teaming up with Goldman Sachs to offer credit lines to some of its sellers. The loan can be drawn and paid like a regular credit card. The amount is up to $1 million, and the annual interest rate is between 6.99% and 20.99%. This is also part of Goldman's push into Main Street finance. Starbucks says it expects its current quarter revenue to plunge by $3 billion. It's also forecasting sales will decline for the rest of the year. The world's largest coffee chain says it will close about 400 of its U.S. stores for good over the next 18 months and cut half of its planned new store openings. The leader of a European bank told Bloomberg it'd be wrong to expect remote working to last after the crisis, since people need to work with people. A recent U.S. survey says half of the workers telecommuting due to the virus crisis are experiencing burnout. AMC Theaters, the world's largest theater operator, plans to reopen most of its theaters globally by mid-July, while limiting audience sizes for social distancing. The theater chain has lost over $2 billion in the second quarter. The question remains whether moviegoers will feel safe returning to theaters.
And coming up, construction workers get back to work on restoring France's Notre Dame Cathedral. Find out when it's expected to be fully restored after the break.
Viewers have described China Uncensored like The Daily Show, but about China.
At the beginning, I was super excited when I got 500 views, and now the show's grown to about 500,000 subscribers on YouTube. One episode reached 7.9 million people. I'm a little freaked out that that many people have seen my face. In 5 years, I see China Uncensored as the sole source of edutainment worldwide.
In France, construction workers are returning to Notre Dame Cathedral after weeks of lockdown. Preparing for restoration is a delicate undertaking, a year since a fire gutted the cathedral. Our France correspondent David Vivez has the story.
After delays in restoration, workers started removing the twisted scaffolding around Paris's Notre Dame Cathedral.
The work of human hands is absolutely decisive for those on the ropes, who clamber all over the structure with all the agility they have. They're on ropes at 40 meters high.
It's a crucial first step before the cathedral's restoration can begin.
This scaffolding was installed prior to the blaze for restoration work on the Arrow of Notre Dame. But after the blaze last year, it became a constant threat because it could have collapsed on the cathedral at any time.
The damaged scaffolding has been surrounded by yet more scaffolding, and an enormous crane was brought in. The operation will cut away 200 tons of metal, and debris from the roof still needs to be cleaned up. It's precision work, but some parts of the cathedral might not be stable.
And as everyone knows, if one stone falls from a part of the vault, the entire vault could be weakened.
Only after this step, which should last 3 to 4 months, will there be a plan for restoration and maybe even redesign. President Emmanuel Macron is pledging the cathedral will be fully restored within 5 years. Reporting by David Vivez, NTD News, Paris.
That's all for today's news. Thank you for tuning in. I'm Paul Graney.